the Industrial Revolution and factory life and immigrants all coming forward. So, of course, just to recap, early industrialization, the first industrial revolution um, was basically changing the way Americans worked and lived. Before the Industrial Revolution, Americans were working at home, master craftsmen, making a few things to sell locally, which are pretty expensive. Afterwards, Americans are going off to work, working in factories, producing items for mass production, which lowers the cost. Of course, as we saw, there were several inventors that sort of stood out during the first Industrial Revolution. Eli Whitney, certainly one of them with interchangeable parts. We looked at the transportation revolution with the ability of steam engines to help travel on the waterways with steamboats. We saw the canal age, and of course, the Erie Canal, the most important canal, 363 miles, linking basically New York City with the Midwest by way of the Great Lakes, obviously cutting down the transportation time, the transportation cost. Railroads, another invention of the first industrial revolution, laying thousands and thousands of miles of track. Of course, the trains were, again, helping more Americans move further and faster with more of their stuff at a lower cost than ever before. You had the communications revolution with the telegraph, which helped more Americans communicate further and faster with more people at a lower cost than ever before. You had the agricultural revolution, which is headed up by John Deere and his steel plow and Cyrus McCormick and his mechanical reaper, which helped grow more food to feed more people at a lower cost with less farmers. So certainly Thomas Jefferson had always envisioned, when he had his vision of America, he had envisioned a vision of an agricultural America, an agrarian America. However, unfortunately for that vision, of course, he was not around really to see the full might of the Industrial Revolution, but he, in his later years, recognized that it was coming, that America would not remain essentially agricultural or essentially agrarian, but that it would become industrialized. So we often think of the first industrial revolution as basically starting in England in the textile industry, moving to America as jump-started by the War of 1812 and interchangeable parts by Eli Whitney. And that first industrial revolution period, there's no set date, but probably most people that read and talk about the first industrial revolution probably see it coming, at least the American industrial revolution sort of sees it sort of ending during the Civil War, and then you have what some historians call the second industrial revolution. Sometimes it's pegged right after the American Civil War, sometimes they use the year 1870 or something like that. And then when the second industrial revolution, again, is sort of up for debate, but usually it's like sometime before World War I. So I've said for the years 1865 to 1850. So basically, this is the Industrial Revolution that just continues. More and more inventions, and the inventions that had been invented were improved. So this is a time when, of course, the iron rail that helped the railroad lay track and move from place to place is replaced by the steel rail. Of course, it's also during the second industrial revolution, you have new forms of business that are organized because you have so many factories and you have so many workers. Sometimes the old forms of doing business were no longer efficient to help you. You have the communications revolution continuing, you have the transportation revolution continuing, you have the agricultural revolution continuing. So oftentimes when you talk about the second industrial revolution, You mentioned such inventions as the Bessemer process, although that was really sort of at the end of the first industrial revolution, which produced a large amount of steel. But certainly things as mundane, and it seems mundane to us as a typewriter. Of course, now you call it a keyboard. But again, it was a great leap forward for the time. Of course, oftentimes the telephone is also mentioned in the second industrial revolution. And the phonograph or the record player that gives way to portable music devices. You have basically electricity coming into its own in the second industrial revolution. You have the creation of an internal combustion engine. That is an automobile during the second industrial revolution. And you also have perhaps one of mankind's longest held dreams coming true, the airplane during the second industrial revolution. The dream of flying with the birds, the dream of flying high over the earth, and had long been with people almost as far back as we have written records. People were sort of wishing they could do that, and the second industrial revolution finally made that vision a reality. Now, those were all good things, but of course, in order to fulfill all this, you're going to have some workers. All these items don't get produced by themselves. They don't magically appear. People have to, first of all, design them. We generally call those inventors. And then people have to make them. We generally call them workers. And as we saw in the early industrial revolution, especially in New England, you had the Lowell system, which basically involved using younger farm girls to work in the factories, and then even the Rhode Island system, which encouraged entire families to work in the factories, including young kids as well. Now, of course, again, the good part about the Industrial Revolution is more goods were available at cheaper prices to a growing number of consumers, leading to economic growth. So there are so many good things about the Industrial Revolution, but we have to remember that, again, most things in life are neither all good or all bad. Generally, there are some good points. Generally, there are some bad points. And for the workers, many of them, they found the Industrial Revolution some bad points. First of all, in the Industrial Revolution in America, by the end of the Civil War and the Second Industrial Revolution, workers are scraping by on less than $500 a year, which is probably about one half of what the average annual wage was. The factory workers would be mostly European immigrants, children, and rural Americans who came to the city for work, remembering that the first Industrial Revolution had these mills and factories located by fast-flowing rivers in New England, in America, to create the water mill, to create that power to run the machines. But then with the invention of the steam engine, you can now move those factories to the cities, closer to the ports, closer to raw materials that are being shipped into your factory, and closer to a place where you can take your manufactured items and send them around the world to sell. And again, there's good and bad points about that. And the good point about that is you cut your transportation cost. That makes the owner of the factory richer, but also that means they can reduce the cost of the item that they're selling, which means more people can buy that item, which then would entail the owner having to open up another factory to produce the more items, which of course means more jobs for more people. So again, there are a lot of good points about this. But again, if you're one of the workers in the factories, probably you are thinking that maybe you deserve a little bit bigger share of the pie, so to speak. So workers often worked 12 to 16-hour days, 6 days a week. Normally you got Sunday off. And unfortunately, many in unhealthy conditions. At first, by the way, in the Lowell system, where they brought the young ladies in, those factories were well maintained. They were well kept. There was a doctor on site. The machines were kept well operating. And of course, the young ladies were given good meals and good housing, all in order to attract the workforce. But as immigrants start to move into America, a large number of immigrants, And as some of these machines displace people that would be farmers from the countryside and cities, pretty soon you have a very large workforce, which means pretty soon factories aren't providing you a place to live. They pay you, so you have to go out to find your own place to live. And pretty soon the factories don't have a doctor on site because how often do you need a doctor? Besides which, you're getting paid, so maybe you should go visit the doctor if you're feeling sick or, and all those nice machines that used to be kept in perfect operating order and nice and safe. And now, well, the important part is the machines are running and making things. Your health and safety as a worker comes secondary to that. So sometimes safety devices in the machine, when they were broken, simply were not replaced because that would cost money, and you'd have to stop the machine to replace the safety device. And so the machines themselves sometimes became very dangerous in these factories. So not only were you working long hours a day, but you could be injured by the machines that you were working on. And the factories themselves, of course, did not have air conditioning at the time. That would come a little bit later. That meant that even though the machines gave off some heat, that was really bad in the summer because, again, the factories were not air conditioned, so you're in an enclosed area that's already heated by the sun from the outside. Now you have additional heat from the inside. That's really bad. So during the summer, the factories were really burning hot inside. But then during the winter months, when it's really cold outside, the machines are still giving off heat, but you can't feel it because there's basically no indoor heat in the factory. And basically any heat that the factory machines make will soon dissipate to the outside, and you'll still be left in the cold. So also in the factories, you worked and you got paid for working. Now, sometimes it was based on the amount of time you spent. Sometimes it was based on how much the material that you made. But you didn't get paid for vacations. If you didn't show up to work, well, you didn't get paid. If you were sick, didn't show up to work, you didn't get paid. There's no, and again, as far as workplace injury is concerned, they would not have a doctor on site anymore. And, if you were injured by the machine and you can work, well, you're not going to get compensated by the owner or the factory. It's just your tough luck. So conditions for workers are going sort of downhill pretty quickly in the second industrial revolution. In fact, things got so bad that people in the factory start trying to organize. They start trying to form groups to try to put pressure on the owner to try to get some of their long hours reduced, to get some compensation if they're injured on the job, to perhaps get a few days off if they're sick. And these groups, first of all, most of them did not succeed at first. The ones that did succeed were skilled laborers, basically skilled workers who knew how to keep the machines working. They were the ones that could organize and then threaten the owner, so to speak, and basically say, hey, owner, if you don't pay us more money, we're going to stop working on your machines. And if the machines stop, that means the owner's not making you money. So probably the owner would meet those people's demands. Now, if you're one of those people on the factory floor and your job is basically take a full spool of thread off one machine and put it on another machine, and you guys go, the owner says, we'd like some more money. The owner's going to get out of here. You don't like your job, you're fired. There's a bunch of people outside, immigrants and people coming in from the countryside. I can hire them just like that for the same job. So skilled workers, people with skills and high education, were able to organize and get more of what they wanted. Hint, hint, hint. The people with lower skills and lower education did not have much success. Now, the first affected group was called the Knights of Labor, and they campaigned at first for a 10-hour day. Yay, we're not working 12 hours a day or 14 hours a day anymore. Ooh, only 10 hours. And then eventually they started campaigning for an 8-hour day. They were also campaigning for equal work for equal pay. So originally the guys in the factory got paid more than women. The women got paid more than the kids. And they were also campaigning for an end to child labor, having these young kids work in the factories. And again, in the Rhode Island system, if it's a family working in the factory, you know, and a new baby's born, well, I mean, who can afford childcare very long? You have to take as soon as you can, you take the kid to the factory and give them a job. So now they're on the payroll and they're helping make your family money. But of course, that kid, of course, as they're working the job, they're never going to school, so they're not getting paid. I'm sorry, they're not getting education. And that's going to really cripple them later on in life. So the Knights of Labor were not just really organizing for the current workers, they were also thinking about the workers' families in this case. So at first the union preferred boycotts, basically, you know, getting people not to buy the goods the factories made. But eventually strikes became commonplace. That is, where basically everyone working in the factory would simply stop working and walk outside and refuse to work until the owner met their demands, whatever their demands were. However, going on strike was illegal in the early 1800s, and even when that right existed, workers could be fired from their jobs. So again, especially the low-level ones that are, you know, basically doing the same job every day that doesn't require much of an education, if they go out on strike, the owner simply brings in that long line of people that are coming to cities to take over your job, and you're fired. Plus, at one point, the factory owners themselves started circulating lists of people. So if you had, you know, been employed in their factory and you struck and you tried to organize people to go out on strike and stop the factory work, they placed your name on the list, and then they sent that list around to all the other factory owners. So once you were fired from one factory, you're not going to be getting a job at another factory, because all those owners know that if they hire you, you're going to be a disgruntled employee. You're going to be always asking for more stuff. So it was pretty tough on the workers. Having said that, that's obviously something has to give. I mean, there's you have all these workers that are working under these pretty primitive conditions and dangerous conditions and for low pay, and then you have the owners who are getting, you know, pretty rich off this. Sure, the consumers are benefiting too. The people that buy the stuff are benefiting because they get more stuff at lower prices. But you really have this dichotomy between sort of the richer owners and the poor workers, and that's going to lead to some friction. In fact, 1886 was not a good year in America. It was called the Great Upheaval. It was a time of a lot of violent strikes. So sometimes when the workers would go out on strike and refuse to work in the factory, and the owner would try to bring in new employees, the old employees would try to stop those new employees from coming in by violence. They would try to beat them up, sometimes shoot them, and naturally the owner would then hire someone to protect the new employees, and oftentimes there would be an exchange of gunfire and fighting and dying around the factory as they try to get the new employees in, because the old employees realized if the new employees came in, the old employees would lose their jobs. So 1886, and during that time period, was a period of great commotion in the United States over these economic conditions. And of course, I listed some of these strikes that were in the Great Railroad Strike and the Haymarket Riot Strike of Chicago. And it came to a point where sometimes when you were hired from the factory job, you actually had to sign a contract that said you would not go out on strike, that you would not join a union, that you would not try to join with others in order to get more money or better wages. And if you didn't sign the contract, they wouldn't hire you. Of course, some of these conditions are being fueled by more and more immigrants. Of course, the good part about these immigrants, whereas they more and more came in, the owners could lower the wage of the workers because many of these immigrants were coming in, basically that they got off the ship and they didn't have a job, sometimes they didn't have family in America, and literally they were going to starve on the street unless they found a job pretty soon. And factory owners in the city quickly realized they could pay these immigrants a lot less than Native Americans that are already here. And of course, so there's good and bad again. It's really good for the immigrants because they're actually getting a job and they won't be starving on the street. It's really bad for the Native Americans who, now lose their job or have to work for less money. And it's also bad because it creates, friction between these immigrants and the people that are here. Of course, on another positive side, if you're lowering the wage of the factory, that means, yes, the owner could be making more money, but also you could be selling your product for even a cheaper price, which means more people are going to buy it, which means you have to open another factory, which means you need more workers, which means, more people are employed. So again, there's good and bad points about the Industrial Revolution going on all the time. Sometimes, one event is both good and bad at the same time. But having said that, again, labor unions did form, but they were mostly unsuccessful. The skilled labor groups were successful, but the unskilled labor, the large labor organizations they tried to create were unsuccessful at first because they had this constant stream of people. They could always fire you and hire someone else. So a lot of these immigrants were coming from Europe at the time. From 1820 to 1860, more than 5.5 million immigrants immigrated to the United States. And you have to remember that even though the ships were getting bigger, 1820, 1830, 1840, the ships could hold several hundred people each by this time. And eventually, of course, they built the large ocean liners starting in basically the 1900s. That means there's a lot of ships going from Europe to America, and not only they're going to America, they're going back to Europe and picking up more people and coming back. So there's a constant stream of ships coming to America and then going back to Europe to pick up more people. So why are Europeans coming? Well, there's several different reasons. Of course, generally, when you leave, it's generally not because of something good happening. Sometimes it is. Sometimes, you get a promotion and you leave to go get a better job. But oftentimes, basically what happens is the job is so terrible where you are, you leave to get a better job because it's terrible where you are. Or you're not making enough money where you are, so you leave to get more money. So basically, something's not right where you are. So in Germany, many Germans coming over, they had been having labor problems of their own in Germany. They had wanted more freedom. Then, by the way, during this time period in the 1800s, there was no one Germany until the later 1800s. There was just several Germanies, and the Germanies were generally run by a king or a prince, and that meant there was not much political freedom. So many of these Germans were actually coming over for political reasons. Many of them had tried to revolt and overthrow their king and queen in revolutions, and they had failed. So they came to America, not necessarily for a better job, but because they wanted political freedom. And many of these Germans were agricultural workers, or actually people that owned their own land. And they had sold their land in Germany and came to America, and they were looking for better political freedom. Now in Ireland, people from Ireland, a little bit different. They were facing starvation. So, and this all goes back to Christopher Columbus and the Columbian Exchange. So when Columbus arrives in America, eventually the Europeans discover the potato. And when they take it back to Europe, they find the potato can feed more people per acre than any crop they grow. And so pretty soon, many places in Europe are planting a lot of potatoes, because by having potatoes, you can have a larger population. And because you have potatoes, you do have a larger population in Europe. So in Ireland, a lot of those fields were planted in potatoes, and they grew other crops to sell, but to eat themselves, basically they just simply grew potatoes and basically had potatoes three meals a day. Unfortunately, eventually, what happens is a little disease called the potato blight works its way from a ship in South America to Ireland, and it starts killing the potatoes. And within basically a year, the potato crops are destroyed. And if you've been surviving by eating potatoes and there's no more potatoes to eat, that means you're going to die. It's not the potato crop that's the real problem that's dying. It's you that have to eat. You're the one that's going to die. So it's estimated that 1/4 of the population of Ireland died during this great potato famine, and about 1/4 of them left the country, and many of them came here to America. So the Irish, you have, again, this dichotomy. The Germans, when they arrived, most of them were somewhat educated. They were farmers or small businessmen. They arrived with money, and they basically could take a railroad and move further inland to buy cheap land. And so they started moving further inland. The Irish, when they got here, they arrived off the ship, they were broke. They needed a job immediately, so they generally stayed in the big cities. And you can see the percentage of, obviously there were a lot more Irish coming during this time period than Germans, but still is a pretty big number. And then you still had people coming from England as well. So the Germans eventually moved really far inland into the midsection of the country. So today, if you look at ancestors of basically German Americans, people who were basically German when they came over and, you know, married Americans, et cetera, and then mixed. Eventually, you see the very red spot, and that means there's like about 50% or more of the people there are German ancestry. And then the dark green areas are 25% or more of the people are German ancestry. So you see, they basically moved when they got here. They didn't stay along the coast. They didn't stay where the factories were. They moved further inland. With the money, they could buy land. They could start businesses, etc. Irish, not so lucky. They had to stay along the coast. And because there were a lot of them coming over, and because they were basically sort of beggars when they got here because they had no money, they were seen sort of as a very low class in America. And this is, I think the sign is from 1916, even still as late as that. There were signs basically throughout America that, you know, says, hey, help wanted, we want someone, but not Irish. No Irish need apply, we're not going to hire you. We'll hire almost anyone else, not going to hire an Irishman. So sometimes they were seen almost as crooks and thieves and low-class bums by many Americans. They did get jobs, for example, building the Transcontinental Railroad, only because very few other people wanted the job. So they basically took the lowest jobs that America had to offer and then eventually worked their way up, just like most immigrant groups in America. Most immigrant groups in America, when they arrive, they basically take the lowest of the low jobs that America has to offer for the lowest of low pay. But eventually, over time, they work their way up. So eventually, in New York, for example, when all these signs used to say Irish no longer need to apply, so eventually the Irish basically ruled the city. They were the mayor, and they were the police, and they were the city leaders. But it just took a time, however, for the Irish to work their way up in these areas. Of course, you can see basically where the Irish basically came to. So the very dark green is basically over 25% Irish ancestry. So again, they sort of stayed along where the factory jobs were. Now, over time, of course, immigration patterns change. So if you look at this chart, you'll notice that in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, up to about to the Civil War, you see the blue lines, which represent really, the dark blue represents the Irish and the Germans, and of course the lighter blue represents England. So you can see from basically 1820 to the time of the Civil War, you had a lot of Irish and Germans coming, and of course Englishmen too. But then over time, you see these other lines coming. The green lines basically represent Eastern Europeans, people who live in East Europe that eventually arrived in America. And then the orangish lines basically represent Central and South Americans who arrive in America. So you can see immigration patterns from different places change over time. And during the time period we're talking about, the immigrants were coming basically from Europe, basically from Western Europe. So unfortunately, with all these immigrants pouring in, there were obviously supporters of immigration, again, provided workers for these low-paying jobs. And also, you could have, because they needed these jobs so desperately, they would take the dangerous jobs and the railroad building jobs, and because they needed money, they were more likely to want to move and to get the jobs. So people could like sell them land in hopes of getting them to go west. So there were some good points, but for many Americans, again, there's, you know, nothing's really good or bad. When I say nothing, many things have good points and bad points. There are obviously, I'm obviously there are some things that are absolutely good and absolutely bad, but for the most part. So as far as these immigrants coming over, you have native-born Americans, people who have lived here, and they're thinking, hey, these people are, taking my job. Or even if they don't take my job, I'm getting a lower salary because they're arriving and they'll take a lower pay, and that doesn't seem very fair. So workers complained about immigrants taking their jobs. Many of them, again, because they, especially the Irish, basically couldn't move very far in. They basically stayed along the cities. The cities started to grow very rapidly because of this immigration. Of course, that drives up housing prices, and that drives up rental prices. It drives up food prices. So if you've been there for a long time and you were in your 40s or 50s, you remembered how cheap everything was back in the day before those immigrants arrived, before those Irish arrived, and now you're complaining, oh, those high prices are because of them. Then you also had somewhat of a little religious dispute. America basically been a Protestant nation, and now, of course, the Irish were mostly Catholic, and so in Protestant areas, what once were Protestant areas, now you had sort of the Catholic Church being very, very strong, and for some people that was an issue, although mainly it really revolved around politics, that is, who has the power to govern. And many of the Irish, when they came over and were they would vote Democratic. The Democratic leaders in the cities would promise them things that would help them out. The Whig Party, the other political party, the Germans basically supported the Whig Party because the Germans were business owners, and so the Whigs were sort of unhappy with immigrants. So there's a political dispute, there are economic disputes. So sometimes Americans form secret societies. These nativist people who are native to Americans were saying, some of the societies' names were sort of stupid. The Supreme Order of the Star Spangled Banner. Oh yeah, that sounds stupid. It sounds stupid now. I guess it sounded awesome back then. But they were basically for banning Catholics or foreign people from holding office. And eventually, some of these nativists started using violence on these immigrants. And when the police pulled in some of these nativists and said, look, we just had a little beating down the street here, and some of the Irish kids were beaten up, and do you know anything about that? And these natives said, no, I know nothing about that. Well, you sure? I mean, someone said they saw you there. I know nothing about that. And some of these nativists answered, I know nothing about that, so much they became known as the know-nothings. And they became known as the Know-Nothing Party. They formed their own little political party, basically just to hate on immigrants. And they sort of reveled in the fact that the police were calling them the Know-Nothings, so they called themselves the Know-Nothings. And it never grew into a major political party, but in some locations it did make a difference in local politics. So commercial and industrial growth increased Americans' incomes. That, again, there's some good things about the Industrial Revolution. A significant number of wealthy merchants and industrials lived in these urban areas where their factories were, and as they got money, not only did they start to show off wealth by building bigger houses, but they also became philanthropists. They also started giving away money. They started building libraries. They started building museums as well. So in sort of the industrial society, first of all, at the bottom, you had the urban poor. You had these city poor who basically are making such low-level jobs. They're just basically barely getting by. They're really dependent upon people to come by and sort of give them stuff, or they go out and rob people. And of course, even in these cities, of course, free blacks is even harder on free blacks, perhaps, than anybody, because, of course, they'd always sort of been discriminated against in these cities, and they'd already sort of try to take the lowest paying jobs anyway. But then come this wave of Irish and other immigrants, and basically, free blacks are losing their jobs, and the prices are going up for free blacks, and so in many ways, they're sort of getting the worst of the worst. Of course, then you have the middle class in these cities. This was the fastest economic economic group of the period because these new household inventions were making life easier for them. Instead of chopping down the wood out there and bringing in those fireplaces that smoked up everything, you had cast iron stoves that you can cook from. You had more food choices available to you thanks to the agricultural revolution. You could communicate with each other better thanks to the communications revolution. You could travel further and faster thanks to the transportation revolution. And because you had more stuff and because things were cheaper now, basically, you could build bigger houses for yourself and have more stuff. And you also had changing families during this time period. Of course, during the farming in the rural areas, kids tended to stay on farms. You generally had large families. But now the industrial revolution in cities, it starts to change. You start to have smaller families because you don't need all the kids to do all the farm work. There's a declining birth rate. And as the kids start to grow up, they don't, again, stay in one place because there's more opportunities for them. Travel is cheaper, and they start to move away from home. So during the Industrial Revolution societies, you had these different class groups, but you also had some leisure time, some free time, especially as you moved up in society. Factory workers basically worked all the time, every day, simply survived. But then the middle class people had free time, and the rich people had lots of free time. So holidays were pretty important, and social clubs were pretty important. Newspapers and magazines thrived for a number of reasons, not just because people had free time, but because prices went down for newspapers. Because with the invention of different types of printing presses, you can make a lot of newspapers more quickly, which means you can drive down a price, which means more people could afford them. You had things, sporting events that normally you hadn't had before, like boxing events in indoor arenas. You had the circus, the P.T. Barnum Circus, which sort of traveled from town to town. And again, but before the Industrial Revolution, there would not have been a lot of people to have paid to see all this stuff. But now, because of the Industrial Revolution, you have more and more people having more and more stuff at lower and lower cost, which means they have extra money that they can spend on leisure activities, on things they wouldn't have spent money on before. So again, the Industrial Revolution, both positive and negative, like many things in life. And that sort of concludes today's look at the second Industrial Revolution.